So my academic background is in philosophy and in theology. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, to Tulane University, where I did my bachelor's and my master's degree in philosophy. I was in the seminary for the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and so I came to have a master's degree in theology before I discerned out of formation, and I taught high school for a number of years. And I was really interested in the philosophical side of things, the way that philosophy undergirds and sort of provides a solid foundation for theology. And that was why I sort of, even though I had degrees kind of in both areas, I gravitated more towards the philosophical side. And so when I decided to do my PhD, I decided to do it in philosophy. What's interesting about the point and the purpose of philosophy and why philosophy is so important, I sometimes get told a couple of different things, but it all comes from the sort of the same mindset, right? I'm sometimes told when I'm out and about and people find out I'm a philosophy professor and they say, oh, isn't that where you just sit around and you just give your opinion on things, right? As if every individual viewpoint counted as a philosophy. And that every particular viewpoint was just another way of looking at something, right? Or to even kind of put it another way, as a small story, I was once at one of my friends, I was with his family for dinner, and his sister's husband was there, and her husband is a very, very practical-minded kind of guy, a very good guy. But he was asking me one time about why philosophy was so important. He said, well, I don't see why philosophy is important at all. And I said, why not? He said, well, because philosophy, and I said, stop. Now you're doing philosophy, right? There's an old saying that kind of goes, you don't have the choice as to whether or not you will philosophize. The choice is whether or not you will do it well or if you will do it poorly, right? Because all people, this is Aristotle's great opening to the book of the Metaphysics, right? All men by nature, we desire to know. We wonder why. We're curious about things and we look into them and we want to know why they are the way they are and how they work the way that they work and so on. Right? We do this naturally. This is part of the human condition, if you want to call it, right? So everyone does it. The real question is whether or not you do it well or whether or not you do it poorly, right? So to come back to the original question, right? So philosophy is not such, to quote Father Waldstein on this, philosophy is not a neutral tool such that different philosophical systems could be equally useful, right? He goes on to say, right, philosophies make very specific claims about reality, claims that can be either true or false, right? And this is the important part. From Plato, from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all the way down, right? The claim of philosophy has always been a looking into reality, right? Looking into the world as it is and wondering why, trying to find out why things are the way they are. And so when you read Aristotle, this comes out very, very clearly in sort of the branching out of the natural sciences to begin with, right? Aristotle's one of the first real natural scientists. And you can see this even in his work on the physics, right? His looking into the causes of motion in the world around us, in his biological works, right? All of the number of works he did on the history of animals, the parts of animals, generation and corruption, and so on, right? It's in that process of wondering why and wondering what the causes of things are, why they are the way they are, why they work the way that they work, that the natural sciences are born. That this process of sort of empirical experimentation, and to the best that Aristotle was able to do it, and of course we've gotten better as the years have gone on, right? Our ability to observe and to conduct experiments has improved, but the mindset is still the same. Right? The mindset behind even the contemporary scientific enterprise is to figure out why things are this way rather than that way, right? And what happens when we do this to such and such a circumstance and so on, right? And it's even from the notion of the natural sciences that the science of mathematics is drawn, right? So the first, if you're familiar with Aristotle's philosophical system, the first of the 9 categories of accidents is that of quantity, right? And it's from this that sort of quantity is pulled out of things, right? So just for a quick example, right? We have the table before us, right? I'm sitting here and there's this table in front of me. But this table has dimension, it has extension, right? And I can pull out from the table, I can leave the wood, the plastic, the metal frame, all of that, even the purpose of the table, everything I can leave behind, and I can pull out just its dimensionality, right, into look at rectangle, right? And you see this even in the ancient geometricians, right, in Euclid and so on, right, and the notion of that geometry even, right, all of and arithmetic, the mathematical sciences, they reflect something real about the world around us, right? So it's not just philosophy and the sciences, that even mathematics on this worldview, right? When you see it as connected to everything, that mathematics tells us something about the world in which we live, right? There's something that we're better off knowing this, right? Our intellect is more perfected by knowing this about the world that we live in. And it continues, right, into all of the various other subject matters, right, whether it's in the arts or literature, and you talk about what are the great questions that these works kind of cause us to contemplate and pursue. When you get into questions of the good life for human beings, which inevitably gives birth to something like political theory, right, all of this is connected, and that's the important part, right? The importance of philosophical study for an integrated liberal arts curriculum is to see the way in which all of this, right, all of the different disciplines are united in the fact that they open up the world to us. They tell us something about the world objectively, the world that we live in, and that this is somehow, right, that this is perfective of the human intellect to know these things, that it's better for us that we know these things. And in coming to know the world around us better, we're able to act more in accordance with the natures that we find there. When we speak about scholastic philosophy, so when you go from the ancient Greeks, so Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and all of and their followers, there's a sort of worldview that's built up around this kind of common language that is handed on from the Greek tradition that the early Christians pick up on, right? And this common philosophical language, it starts to be organized. Terms kind of come to be concretized, and definitions are solidified, and propositions begin to be put together. And so when we speak about the scholastic edifice, scholastic philosophy and theology, we mean that sort of very general system of thinking, or at the very least, a common language that was shared among it at a certain point in high Christendom between all of the various philosophic and theological schools, right? And the major representatives of these schools were 3. You, of course, had Thomism, the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, as it was kept alive in the Dominican order, and Thomas's kind of his later commentators, usually who were Dominicans, but not always. You also had in the Jesuit school, the Jesuit school of thought based off of their great thinker Francisco Suarez, right, Suarezianism. And then, of course, you had the Franciscan school of thought, kind of the great central figure for the Franciscans was, of course, that of St. Bonaventure. And even though there were various discrepancies and disagreements between a lot of these schools of thought, they still shared a very common language and a common viewpoint, right? And this is probably the most important aspect. They shared a common viewpoint that the words that they were speaking, the things that they talked about, that these words corresponded to something real, something true, something that was objective outside of them, right? That was outside of their intellect, that was outside of their mind, that these words described real essences. the real natures of things in the world around us, such that we could all talk about them, right? And maybe some of them, as a quick example, the Franciscans and the Dominicans kind of had a dispute over whether or not there could be something spiritual about matter, right? Whether the Franciscans wondered if there was spiritual matter or not, and for the Dominicans, matter was just corporeal, right? But they both recognized at the end of the day that matter was what Aristotle called the principle of potency. It was the principle of change in things, and they both understood that, right? So even though there were various discrepancies among the schools, and this is why there were divisions into different schools of thought, they shared a commitment to realism, right? That the world is objective, the world is mind independent, that God exists, that the world is real, and that God can truly communicate himself to us in something like divine revelation, right? This was what made sacred theology, the science of theology, possible. And so when we talk then about scholastic philosophy, we mean sort of that great general edifice that was built up of the Dominicans, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the way they all received this sort of perennial philosophic tradition. So Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonist synthesis from Augustine, and the early medieval kind of commentaries of Boethius and so on, right? I mean, the tradition continues and the tradition builds. And it's when we discuss scholasticism, we mean then the way that this all sort of comes together in the great period of high Christendom, when you had the great schools, the University of Paris, right, and later the later schools like the University at Salamanca in Spain and so on, right? This is what we mean by scholasticism or scholastic philosophy and theology. The great hallmark of the tradition, the philosophic tradition prior to the modern age, was that principle and that commitment to realism, as we were saying, right? That the world is truly, that the world is independent of us, and there are things, there are natures, there are essences in the world that we can know and that we can describe. And as I said at the beginning, as Aristotle mentions at the beginning of the Metaphysics, the basis of philosophy for him is that notion of wonder. Right? We all want to know why. We're all very naturally curious about things. We want to know why things are the way they are. And it was this wonder that for the great part of human history was the basis of the philosophic and scientific enterprise, right? Wondering why. And so you test and experiment and you think about and so on. With Descartes, a lot of that shifts, right? Now, Descartes gets the credit. He is rightly called the father of modern philosophy, but it is important to note that the groundwork was laid well before Descartes. And you have something of the rise of, although that's perhaps not incredibly accurate to say the rise of, because nominalism has always been around. But after the thought of St. Thomas, after St. Thomas's death around 1275 or so, nominalism really comes into a resurgence with the thought of William of Ockham, right? And this is where I was going, right? It's actually Ockham that sort of lays down this foundation, and the point of nominalism, or the thought of nominalism, is that there are no real essences in things, right? You see a bunch of pine trees around, right? The Thomist, or not necessarily even just the Thomist, but the realist looks at those and goes, each one of those individual things shares something, shares a real nature that makes it a pine tree, right? And Occam would deny this. Occam would say, and this is where we get the word nominalism, right, from the Latin nomen. It's just the name that you give it, that these things look similar to me, so I'm going to call them all by the same name, right? And it's this viewpoint that is very corrosive of the traditional, the realist metaphysics, right? The very denial that there are essences, that there are natures in things. Right? And this is also a source of continued philosophic debate back and forth, right? And so, okay, in the late 16th century, mid to late 16th century, here we have Descartes. Descartes is a mathematician, right, also, and one of the things he recognizes, he sees, you can't find anyone who disputes the mathematical proof for like the Pythagorean theorem, right? Or in any of the mathematical proofs, even today, right? Nobody doubts these things. And yet Descartes noticed that you could find a lot of people who doubted the existence of God, or who doubted the immortality of the soul. And he sort of he tries to set out on this journey to set those truths, and I'm willing to impute good motives to Descartes. He's trying to find a way to set those truths on just as firm a foundation, such that no one can doubt them the same way no one doubts the truths of mathematics, right? But in doing so, Descartes shifts the entire method of doing philosophy, right? We said Aristotle begins in wonder. We want to know why. For Descartes, he's sort of, because he's looking for certainty, Descartes begins with methodical doubt, right? He says, because I'm looking for something that's absolutely certain, I'm going to doubt everything that cannot be absolutely or conclusively known to me, such that it cannot be doubted, it cannot be denied in any way, shape, or form. And this is, everybody knows this is the great dream thought, the dream scenario, right? We're all sort of familiar with this too, right? How often do we sit, we're dreaming, we're in our bed, we're sleeping, we're dreaming, and yet we think that we're awake. Right? In the dream, you experience the fear or the happiness or the whatever it is that's going on, right? That you would experience were this really happening to you, right? And very often, when you look back on it the next day, right, you thought you were in the dream, right? And Descartes said, okay, well, granted that this is possible, this is the kick, right? Well, how do you know you're not dreaming now? And I always first of all, when I bring this up to my students, I have to apologize to them that if they're dreaming about being in my philosophy class, I have to apologize greatly that they don't have anything else worth dreaming about, right? But because so Descartes thinks that this gives him reason to think that even our sensory data can be doubted, right? Maybe I'm not actually seeing what I think that I'm seeing, right? We know this. I talk about this a lot when I teach this. When you're driving down the road and you think that you see the oil slick or the water on the road in front of you, right? And by the time you get down there, of course, the road is dry. We're familiar. We talk about our eyes playing tricks on us, and I thought that I heard something, and so on. So Descartes gets to, he's like, okay, fine, I don't trust any of this, right? My eyes could be playing tricks on me, I could be dreaming, whatever. The thing that he gets at, the one thing that he thinks that he absolutely cannot be in doubt of, is that he exists, right? Because the point is that if I did not exist, then there wouldn't even be an I to be deceived in the first place, right? So that even if I'm deceived about all else, I can't be deceived about the fact that at least there is something that I am, right? And this is the shift, right? So for Aristotle and the realist philosophic tradition, where you started was the world outside of you, right? The way that things are. For Descartes, everything gets turned on its head, and he starts with me, the individual subject. Right? And as you go through the rest of Descartes' thought, it's from myself, it's from my own existence that we start to build back out to the world existing, to even that God exists, right? And to the souls being immortal and everything else, right? But it's no longer grounded in the world. It's grounded in me, right? And this is the whole shift towards subjectivism. Right? And it's this shift that cascades further and further. And when I teach the history of modern philosophy, I go through this and I draw out this thread. You see Hume pick this up and said, well, if first of all, if following nominalism, if there are no real essences in things, right? And I'm not really sure about the nature. Not being sure about the essences or universals, right? The essences, the natures of things. Hume ends with, I can't even really be sure about the nature of cause and effect, right? Hume even grounds something like causality in the subjective mind, right? Is you don't actually see one thing causing another. Hume argues that you see one event, and then you see a second event, and because these two things, he says, are constantly conjoined, so often, somewhere in your mind, you think of them as one causing the other. Right? But again, that grounds even the notion of causation, which is central, right? It's kind of the foundational thought to the scientific enterprise, right? Is looking at causes, why things are the way they are. And Hume says, well, you really don't see, you have no reason to think that looking out at the world as it is, right? Causation is just in the mind. And from these two, from Descartes and from Hume, you have Kant, right? Who on the one hand is trying to reconcile both of these things together, right? Kant thinks that there is a world outside of you. It's just that Kant thinks that you can never know the world outside of you, that everything that is subjective, everything that's in your mind, you project onto the world around you, right? And this modern philosophical train, right? It keeps going and it keeps snowballing until finally you kind of end up with you have certain thinkers like George Berkeley, who is purely subjectivist. For Berkeley, there's not even a world outside of himself, right? Everything is in the mind. You have philosophical positions like absurdism, right? That there's no such thing as cause or effect or meaning or purpose, and it's useless to even try and figure those things out. And you also have figures like Nietzsche, right? And people are usually surprised when they hear that I'm kind of a fan of Nietzsche, only because I think he's so correct. And it's not that he's correct in himself. Nietzsche is correct if you grant him his starting premise, right? That if there is no God, there is no nature, there is nothing that makes sense in the world, then the rest of Nietzsche it really just follows. There only then exists the assertion of my own will. Right, and this is the will to power and the Superman, right? The overman, the one who can despise all of the rules and the morals of society because why? They don't matter, right? Only I matter, and I have to be strong enough to impose my will on everyone else, right? And it's really funny just how much of this I think we can see in contemporary society, right? The certain pathologies of sort of the way that people in our culture, our culture itself, the way it behaves, the direction that certain things are going. And it's interesting, you can sort of all trace it back through the evolution of modern philosophy, right? So again, why is philosophy important? It's because, to quote the title of a book that was published in the early 50s, I think, was ideas have consequences, right? If you look around and you kind of want to know why is contemporary culture so messed up, it's because our philosophy is so very messed up, right? And the only way out, or the only way back, the only way that's corrective, is to go back to a true worldview, right? And even not necessarily going backwards, but to find again, right, a true worldview that actually corresponds with the way that things are. And it's only then we can start to realign our thinking, our will, our behavior, culture, society, and so on, when we find that true philosophy again. And that's why this is important. So at the Collegium, this is the reason that the classical and perennial philosophic and theologic worldview, right, that the perennial philosophy and scholastic theology forms the backbone of our curriculum. It's what ties in, as I said earlier, it's what ties in all of the other disciplines, right? So even when we teach physics and biology and programming and all of the other disciplines, right? Even when we teach all of the other disciplines, it's with this realist philosophic background in mind. And it does actually change, and it affects the way that we teach. I was speaking with our professor for the philosophy of mathematics course just the other day, And even the philosophy of mathematics course, because it's grounded in that sort of Aristotelian, realist, perennial philosophy, he was telling me, and he's never seen any other school, any other college, anywhere else that approaches mathematics in this fashion. And this was one of the things he was very excited about. And it's one of the things that we do with all of our subject matter. We teach physics according to this realist perspective that ties in the philosophy to experimental physical science, something that as far as I know, isn't done anywhere else. Right? And it's only then with this sort of worldview that I think our students can truly participate in that Catholic mission to go out into the world. And as Christ says, Matthew 28, the Great Commission, right, to teach all nations to observe what Christ has commanded us, right? That our curriculum being grounded in this tradition prepares our students, one, for what's true. Two, it teaches them how to defend against the errors deviating from that tradition. And finally, it even gives them a means for practically applying what they know about the world to everyday situations. Right? So this is one of the other things people sometimes think, that the study of philosophy or the liberal arts is a useless enterprise. And depending on what you mean by useless, it can be true, right? This is one of the first things Aristotle says about it. Once in the ancient world, once the necessities of life were taken care of, then, yeah, people were free enough to be able to look up at the stars, right? To do astronomy, to do geometry, to do things that didn't affect life or death, right? The way that agriculture does. And so this is why Aristotle says, yeah, it is useless. Because this is knowledge that's not put towards any sort of concrete practicality, right? It's once all those things are taken care of, you can actually move on to, he would say, the more important things, right? The study of the higher things. So on the one hand, you could say that it's useless, and that's also what makes it so very important. But on the other hand, there's something eminently practical about it. To quote the great Thomist political philosopher, Father Charles McCoy, he says just very succinctly, in order to be practical, we have to know how things really are. Right? It's to even quote G.K. Chesterton, where he talks about it's only someone, or to paraphrase Chesterton, right? See, it's only someone who has a knowledge of the ideal, of the way that things should be, who can actually turn his attention to the concrete matter at hand. Believe it or not, one of Chesterton's criticisms of the politicians of his day were that they were too practical. Right? He actually said if only they were visionaries, right? Only if they were philosophers who had a vision of the good, then he says, then something practical might be done, right? Because you actually have to have a vision of the way that things are in themselves. When you talk about political order or the notion of the good, the way that things should be, the way human beings do interact among each other, it's only in that mindset that you can direct something like the political art to good governance, right? So on the other hand, philosophy is very, very useful, right? In the sense that it's the mindset behind trying to figure out the way that things really are, and only knowing the way things really are can you act accordingly. And this is the worldview that we try to impart to all of our students at the Collegium.